Mexican drug war effects in Mexico. Casualties. 200,000 people died in the conflict by June 2017, while another 30,000 were missing. 83,191 were killed during Felipe Calderón's administration between December 2006 and October 2012, while 23,640 died in the first 14 months of Enrique Peña Nieto's administration between December 2012 and January 2014. By the start of 2011, 1,000 children had been killed. 58 reporters also died by the start of 2010. 511 American civilians were killed in Mexico between 2006 and 2012. Violence. The Mexican Attorney General's office has claimed that 9 of 10 victims of the Mexican drug war are members of organized crime groups, although this figure has been questioned by other sources. Deaths among military and police personnel are an estimated 7% of the total. The states that suffer from the conflict most are Baja California, Guerrero, Chihuahua, Michoacán, Tamaulipas, Nuevo León, and Sinaloa. President Calderón's government is currently fighting the traffickers, especially in his home state of Michoacán, but also including operations in the states of Jalisco and Guerrero, and in 2009 drug-related violence increased considerably in Sonora. By January 2007, these various operations had extended to the states of Guerrero as well as the so-called Golden Triangle states of Chihuahua, Durango, and Sinaloa. In the following February, the states of Nuevo León and Tamaulipas were included as well. Seizures and arrests have jumped since Calderón took office in December 2006, and Mexico has extradited more than 100 people wanted in the U.S. On July 10, 2008. The Mexican government announced plans to nearly double the size of its federal police force to reduce the role of the military in combating drug trafficking. The plan, known as the Comprehensive Strategy Against Drug Trafficking, also involves purging local police forces of corrupt officers. Elements of the plan have already been set in motion, including a massive police recruiting and training effort intended to reduce the country's dependence in the drug war on the military. On July 16, 2008, the Mexican Navy intercepted a 10-meter-long narco-submarine traveling about 200 kilometers off the southwest of Oaxaca. In a raid, special forces rappelled from a helicopter onto the deck of the submarine and arrested 4 smugglers before they could scuttle their vessel. The vessel was found to be loaded with 5.8 tons of cocaine and was towed to Huatulco, Oaxaca, by a Mexican Navy patrol boat. One escalation in this conflict is the traffickers' use of new means to claim their territory and spread fear. Cartel members have broadcast executions on YouTube and on other video sharing sites or shock sites, since the footage is sometimes so graphic that YouTube will not host the video. The cartels have also hung banners on streets stating their demands and/or warnings. The 2008 Morelia grenade attacks took place on September 15, 2008, when 2 hand grenades were thrown onto a crowded plaza, killing 10 people and injuring more than 100. Some see these efforts as intended to sap the morale of government agents assigned to crack down on the cartels, others see them as an effort to let citizens know who is winning the war. At least 12 Mexican norteño musicians have been murdered. Most of the victims performed what are known as narco corridos, popular folk songs that tell the stories of the Mexican drug trade, and celebrate its leaders as folk heroes. The extreme violence is jeopardizing foreign investment in Mexico, and the finance minister, Agustín Carstens, said that the deteriorating security alone is reducing gross domestic product annually by 1% in Mexico, Latin America's second-largest economy. Teachers in the Acapulco region were extorted, kidnapped and intimidated by cartels, including death threats demanding money. They went on strike in 2011. Government corruption. Mexican cartels advance their operations, in part, by corrupting or intimidating law enforcement officials. Mexican municipal, state, and federal government officials, along with the police forces, often work together with the cartels in an organized network of corruption. A pax mafioso is a specific example of corruption which guarantees a politician votes and a following in exchange for turning a blind eye towards a particular cartel. The International Narcotics Control Board, INCB, reports that although the central government of Mexico has made concerted efforts to reduce corruption in recent years, it remains a serious problem. Some agents of the Federal Investigations Agency, AFI, are believed to work as enforcers for various cartels, and the Attorney General, PGR, reported in December 2005 that nearly 1,500 of AFI's 7,000 agents were under investigation for suspected criminal activity and 457 were facing charges. In recent years, the federal government conducted purges and prosecution of police forces in Nuevo Laredo, Michoacán, Baja California, and Mexico City. The anti-cartel operations begun by President Calderón in December 2006 includes ballistic checks of police weapons in places where there is concern that police are also working for the cartels. In June 2007, President Calderón purged 284 federal police commanders from all 31 states and the federal district. Under the cleanup operation performed in 2008, several agents and high-ranking officials have been arrested and charged with selling information or protection to drug cartels. Some high-profile arrests were Victor Gerardo Garay Cadena, Chief of the Federal Police; Noé Ramirez Montellano, ex-Chief of the Organized Crime Division, CEDO; José Luis Santiago Vasconcelos, ex-Chief of the Organized Crime Division, CEDO; and Ricardo Gutierrez Vargas, who is the ex-director of Mexico's Interpol office. In January 2009, Rodolfo de la Guardia Garcia, ex-director of Mexico's Interpol office, was arrested. Julio Cesar Godoy Toscano, who was just elected July 5, 2009 to the lower house of Congress, is charged with being a top-ranking member of La Familia Michoacana drug cartel and of protecting this cartel. He is now a fugitive. In May 2010, an NPR report collected allegations from dozens of sources, including U.S. and Mexican media, Mexican police officials, politicians, academics, and others, that Sinaloa cartel had infiltrated and corrupted the Mexican federal government and the Mexican military by bribery and other means. According to a report by the U.S. Army Intelligence Section in Leavenworth, over a 6-year period, of the 250,000 soldiers in the Mexican army, 150,000 deserted and went into the drug industry. The 2010 NPR report also stated that Sinaloa was colluding with the government to destroy other cartels and protect itself and its leader, Chapo. Mexican officials denied any corruption in the government's treatment of drug cartels. Cartels had previously been reported as difficult to prosecute because members of the cartels have infiltrated and corrupted the law enforcement organizations that are supposed to prosecute them, such as the Office of the Attorney General. Impact on human rights. The drug control policies Mexico has adopted to prevent drug trafficking and to eliminate the power of the drug cartels have adversely affected the human rights situation in the country. These policies have given the responsibilities for civilian drug control to the military, which has the power to not only carry out anti-drug and public security operations but also enact policy. According to the United States Department of State, the police and the military in Mexico were accused of committing serious human rights violations as they carried out government efforts to combat drug cartels. Some groups are especially vulnerable to human rights abuse as collateral to drug law enforcement. Specifically in northern border states that have seen elevated levels of drug-related violence, human rights violations of injection drug users, EDUs, and sex workers by law enforcement personnel include physical and sexual violence, extortion, and targeting for accessing or possession of injection equipment or practicing sex work, although these activities are legal. Such targeting is especially deleterious because members of these marginalized communities often lack the resources and social or political capital to vindicate their rights. Immense power in the executive branch and corruption in the legislative and judiciary branches also contribute to the worsening of Mexico's human rights situation, leading to such problems as police forces violating basic human rights through torture and threats, the autonomy of the military and its consequences, and the ineffectiveness of the judiciary in upholding and preserving basic human rights. Some of the forms of human rights violations in recent years presented by human rights organizations include illegal arrests, secret and prolonged detention, torture, rape, extrajudicial execution, and fabrication of evidence. Drug policy fails to target high-level traffickers. In the 1970s, as part of the international Operation Condor, the Mexican government deployed 10,000 soldiers and police to a poverty-stricken region in northern Mexico plagued by drug production and leftist insurgency. Hundreds of peasants were arrested, tortured, and jailed, but no major drug traffickers were captured. The emergence of internal federal agencies that are often unregulated and unaccountable also contributes to the occurrence of human rights violations. The Federal Investigations Agency, Agencia Federal de Investigación AFI, of Mexico had been involved with numerous human rights violation cases involving torture and corruption. In one case, detainee Guillermo Vélez Mendoza died while in the custody of AFI agents. The AFI agent implicated in his death was arrested, but he escaped after being released on bail. Similarly, nearly all AFI agents evaded punishment and arrest due to the corrupt executive and judiciary system and the supremacy of these agencies. The Attorney General's office reported in December 2005 that 1/5 of its officers were under investigation for criminal activity, and that nearly 1,500 of AFI's 7,000 agents were under investigation for suspected criminal activity and 457 were facing charges. The AFI was finally declared a failure and was disbanded in 2009. Ethnic prejudices have also emerged in the drug war, and poor and helpless indigenous communities have been targeted by the police, military, drug traffickers and the justice system. According to the National Human Rights Commission, Mexico, Comisión Nacional de los Derechos Humanos CNDH, nearly 1/3 of the indigenous prisoners in Mexico in 2001 were in prison for federal crimes, which are mostly drug-related. Another major concern is the lack of implementation of the Leahy Law in U.S. and the consequences of that in worsening the human rights situation in Mexico. Under this U.S. law, no member or unit of a foreign security force that is credibly alleged to have committed a human rights violation may receive U.S. security training. It is alleged that the U.S., by training the military and police force in Mexico, is in violation of the Leahy Law. In this case, the U.S. Embassy officials in Mexico in charge of human rights and drug control programs are blamed with aiding and abetting these violations. In December 1997, a group of heavily armed Mexican Special Forces soldiers kidnapped 20 young men in Ocotlan, Jalisco, brutally torturing them and killing one. 6 of the implicated officers had received U.S. training as part of the Grupo Aeromóvil de Fuerzas Especiales, GAFE, training program. Impact on public health. As a result of spillover along the U.S.-bound drug trafficking routes and more stringent border enforcement, Mexico's northern border states have seen increased levels of drug consumption and abuse, including elevated rates of drug injection 10 to 15 times the national average. These rates are accompanied by mounting rates of HIV and STIs among injection drug users, EDUs, and sex workers, reaching a 5.5% prevalence in cities such as Tijuana and Ciudad Juárez, which also report STI rates of 64% and 83%, respectively. Violence and extortion of EDUs and sex workers directly and indirectly elevate the levels of risk behavior and poor health outcomes among members of these groups. Marginalization of these vulnerable groups by way of physical and sexual violence and extortion by police threatens the crossover of infection from high-prevalence groups to the general population. In particular, decreased access to public health services, such as syringe exchange programs, and confiscation of syringes, even in view of syringe access and possession being legal, can precipitate a cascade of health harms. Geographic diffusion of epidemics from the northern border states elsewhere is also possible with the rotation of police and military personnel stationed in drug conflict areas with high infection prevalence. Journalists and the media. The increase in violence related with organized crime has significantly deteriorated the conditions in which local journalism is practiced. In the first years of the 21st century, Mexico was considered the most dangerous country in the world to practice journalism, according to groups like the National Human Rights Commission, Reporters Without Borders, and the Committee to Protect Journalists. Between 2000 and 2012, several dozen journalists, including Miguel Ángel López Velasco, Luis Carlos Santiago, and Valentín Valdés Espinosa, were murdered there for covering narco-related news. Offices of Televisa and of local newspapers have been bombed. The cartels have also threatened to kill news reporters in the U.S. who have done coverage on the drug violence. Some media networks simply stopped reporting on drug crimes, while others have been infiltrated and corrupted by drug cartels. In 2011, Notiver journalist Miguel Ángel López Velasco and his wife and son were murdered in their home. About 74% of the journalists killed since 1992 in Mexico have been reporters for print newspapers, followed in number by internet media and radio at about 11% each. Television journalism only includes 4% of the deaths. These numbers are not proportional to the audience size of the different mediums. Most Mexican households have a television, a large majority have a radio, but only a small number have the internet, and the circulation numbers for Mexican newspapers are relatively low. Since harassment neutralized many of the traditional media outlets, anonymous blogs like Blog del Narco took on the role of reporting on events related to the drug war. The drug cartels responded by murdering bloggers and social media users. Twitter users have been tortured and killed for posting and denouncing information of the drug cartel's activities. In September 2011, user Ninad Laredo of the website Nuevo Laredo en Vivo was murdered allegedly by the Zetas. In May 2012, several journalist murders occurred in Veracruz. Regina Martinez of Proceso was murdered in Jalapa. A few days later, 3 Veracruz photojournalists were tortured and killed and their dismembered bodies were dumped in a canal. They had worked for various news outlets, including Notiver, Diario Oz, and TV Azteca. Human rights groups condemned the murders and demanded the authorities investigate the crimes. Murders of politicians. Since the start of the Mexican drug war in 2006, the drug trafficking organizations have slaughtered their rivals, killed policemen, and now increasingly targeted politicians, especially local leaders. Most of the places where these politicians have been killed are areas plagued by drug-related violence. Part of the strategy used by the criminal groups behind the killings of local figures is the weakening of the local governments. For example, Maria Santos Garras Salazar, the former mayor of the town in western Mexico, who had survived 3 earlier assassination attempts and the murder of her husband, was abducted and beaten to death in November 2012. Extreme violence puts politicians at the mercy of the mafias, thus allowing the cartels to take control of the fundamental government structures and expand their criminal agendas. In addition, because mayors usually appoint local police chiefs, they are seen by the cartels as key assets in their criminal activities to control the police forces in their areas of influence. The cartels also seek to control the local governments to win government contracts and concessions. These public works help them ingrain themselves in the community and gain the loyalty and respect of the communities in which they operate. Politicians are usually targeted for 3 reasons. 1. Political figures who are honest pose a direct threat to organized crime, and are consequently killed by the cartels. 2. Politicians make arrangements to protect a certain cartel and are killed by a rival cartel. And 3. A cartel simply kills politicians to heat up the turf of the rival cartel that operates in the area. Massacres and exploitation of migrants. The cartels engage in kidnapping, ransom, murder, robbery, and extortion of migrants traveling from Central America through Mexico on their way to El Norte, the United States and Canada. Sometimes the cartels force the migrants to join their organization and work for them. Mass graves have been also discovered in Mexico containing bodies of migrants. In 2011, 177 bodies were discovered in a mass grave in Tamaulipas, the same area where the bodies of 72 migrants were discovered in 2010. In a case in San Fernando, Mexico, most of the dead had died of blunt force trauma to the head. The cartels have also infiltrated the Mexican government's immigration agencies, and attacked and threatened immigration officers. The National Human Rights Commission of Mexico, Comisión Nacional de los Derechos Humanos, CNDH, said that 11,000 migrants had been kidnapped in 6 months in 2010 by drug cartels. Human trafficking. There are documented links between the drug cartels and human trafficking for forced labor, forced prostitution, and rape. A wife of a narco described a system in which young girls became prostitutes and then were forced to work in drug factories. Circa 2011, Los Zetas reportedly began to move into the prostitution business, including the prostitution of children, after previously being only suppliers of women to already existing networks. The U.S. State Department says that the practice of forced labor in Mexico is larger in extent than forced prostitution. Mexican journalists like Lydia Cacho have been threatened, beaten, raped, and forced into exile for reporting on these facts.